All right, so in this video, we are going to go ahead and take a look at measures of center. So the measures of center is this statistical concept that we use to essentially represent where a lot of our data is in a data set. And we have several measures of center, and we're going to look at several sets of data so we can see when we would want to use a particular measure of center. So the measure of center represents a typical value for the center of the data. And we have three different ways that we're going to look at measures, look at the center, or the measure of center, I should say. And the first one we're going to look at is mean. And we're going to look at a typical example of a data set where mean is going to be our best measure of center. But before we talk about why that's the case, let's define mean. Mean is the number of, or the sum of the data, I should say, the sum of the data divided by the number of data points, aka the average. In particular, this would not just be the average, this would be the arithmetic average. Arithmetic average. But that essentially is, if we're talking about the height of US women, for example, you would just take the heights of all of the women in the United States, add them up, and then divide by the number of women in the United States. And that would give you the mean or the average. The average is typically represented by a symbol called X bar. And you might be able to see why it's called X bar, because it's an X with a bar over it, and it means the mean. So this is the mean. And in our example here, you can see that it looks like the average height of a US woman is about, I would say, looking at this graph, it's in between 5.6 and, or 5'6" and 5'4". So it would be 5 feet, 5 inches tall. And normally when we use the mean to represent the center of a data set, it's when we have data which looks like this. This is a bell curve. It is distributed evenly on both sides. Both sides of it are symmetric, if you remember that word from when we were talking about parabolas. And it follows a very consistent distribution pattern. It's not skewed in one way or the other. This is typically when we're going to use mean. You can still use mean in other data sets because it can be useful, especially in comparison to some of the other measures of center that we'll see later. But in this particular example, our mean would be the most representative measure of center, because when we're talking about mean, we are usually talking about a symmetric piece of data, a bell curve, as you can see here when we have women's heights. All right, so that's our first measure of center. And we are going to go ahead and look at another measure of center as well. And that one will be related to the distribution of annual household incomes in the United States with an estimate from 2010. So I still have my definition for measure of center up here, but now we're going to need to talk about a new measure. And that new measure, and hopefully you have already come across this before, is the median. And that should be in black instead of white, so it can actually be readable. The median. The median is the middle point of the data set. When it is ordered from least to greatest. So the median is our middle point. It's another way we can represent the center of our data set, and it's the one that represents the middle point in our data set. So let's look at this data set and think about why we might want to use the median instead of the mean. And there's a very specific reason for that. So the median of this data set is where roughly half the data appears. And this is divided into bins of $5,000. And you can see that there's many, many more people in these tall columns on the left side here than there are in the decreasingly small columns on the other side, notwithstanding the last two, which have much larger bins. They're 50,000 and everything over 250,000, respectively, in their size. So if we look at the graph, it actually already tells us where our median is. And our median is at this point right here. It is between $50,000 and $55,000. And you might be saying, well, why are we using the median instead of the mean? The reason why we're using the median instead of the mean is because this data is heavily skewed. And it's skewed by these values over here. In particular, it's not actually skewed by the 250,000. It's basically just skewed by this group, the last one. And the reason why it's so skewed is because if you think about the way that incomes in the United States are distributed, as you can see, half of the population makes less than $55,000 a year. The problem, though, is that there's a very, very small number of people that make an absolutely enormous amount of money. They just make piles and piles and piles of money, like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, somebody like that. And that one person is able to single-handedly skew the average up. And when you have a decent number of those people, as you can see, there's a pretty large percentage of households. 2% of the households make over 250,000. That group of people, when you have no upper limit on how much money you can make, actually can cause the average to change significantly. But that average doesn't give essentially a realistic representation of how people are living. The median income of roughly $50,000 is a more realistic estimate for how people live, because it tells you, well, half the people make money less than this and half the people make money more than this. And it doesn't allow it to be skewed by these extreme data points on the right here that I circled in orange. So the median we choose to use when the data is the most skewed. And what it is the middle point between all the data points when they are ordered from greatest to least, as you can see in the example here, ordered from under $5,000 to over $250,000. So that is our second measure of center. And the median and mean are ones that you definitely always need to think about, which one can I actually use, because you cannot always use the mean in data sets. And you also cannot always use the median, although you should always check before we move on to our third measure of center, which is the mode. So let's go ahead and take a look at our mode over here. All right, now the mode has one extremely big use. Now, the mode is probably the easiest of them to grasp because I think it's the most straightforward. The mode is just the value that appears the most times. Now, the one thing about the mode is that the mode, there's not always just one. Sometimes you can have one mode. The example shown has one mode. Sometimes two modes, multiple modes, which two modes is, or no mode. So if you had a data set that had 100 unique entries in it, you would say that there was no mode in that data set. But generally, if there's a manageable number that are tied from the most number of values, then you would say we have these number of modes. So the time when you want to use the mode is essentially when the mode is the only available option. That's most frequently when you will choose to use the mode. And you might be saying, but why wouldn't I be able to use the mode? If we look at this set of data, we asked people to choose what their favorite color was. You can't really find an average of yellow, red, blue, green, and pink. Like, it doesn't really make sense to look for an average of the colors. And even if you did try and average them with whatever like gross brown color you'd end up coming up with, that doesn't really represent the fact that people like blue and red the most of the two, most of the five colors coming in first and second. Our mode here, our actual mode is blue, since it appears the most times. 6 students in this example chose blue, 5 chose red, but blue would be the mode. Likewise, you can't really say there's a median either, because you can't really stack up these categories of data in a way that makes sense. It's like, you can't really say, well, I'm going to start with yellow, 1, 2, 3, 4 yellows, and then 5 reds, and then 6 blues. That doesn't really make sense. You could just do them in any order. And what I'm trying to get at is the reason why we're using the mode here and we can't use the mean or the median is because this is qualitative data. And qualitative data, or this is sometimes called categorical data. I believe they're actually synonyms, are essentially data that you can put into like discrete categories. It's not continuous. That's probably the best way to describe this, is to go back to what we learned. This data is discrete. You have red, you have blue. Those are two discrete options. By contrast, in the other examples that we saw earlier, housing income, for example, you can measure it down to dollars and cents. So it actually has specific values for everything. And as a result, it's continuous. Basically, anything that you can measure like fractional amounts is something that we can use the mean and median on. Whereas if you're just left with something like this, where it's like my favorite color, you can't find an average or a median of favorite color because you can't even order them. So that gives you an idea of when you'd like to use the mean, median, and mode, and hopefully gives you a good idea of actually figuring out how to use them. That being said, though, we're going to do a couple of examples. We're going to do an example of each of them in an upcoming video.